Welcome back. Get comfortable. Let everything slow. Before the betrayal, there was the dream, and the dream was magnificent. The Emperor of Mankind. The Emperor of Mankind is one of the most extraordinary figures in any fictional setting, and that is a significant claim. He is described as the most powerful human psychic who has ever lived, a being who has existed since the earliest days of humanity, thousands of years before the events of the Horus Heresy, walking through history under different names, guiding and protecting the human species through the long darkness of pre-imperial history. He is immortal in a specific sense. His soul is too powerful to fully die, too large for the warp to consume. Sustained across thousands of years by a directed act of will that never fully relaxes. He has watched civilizations rise and fall. He has been warrior and philosopher and king and wanderer, accumulating the specific wisdom of someone who has had millennia to consider every aspect of the human condition. What he decided, after all of those millennia, was that humanity needed to be united, not simply organized, not under the kind of governance that human empires had produced and lost throughout history, but genuinely united across the galaxy, under a single banner, with a single purpose: the Age of Strife. The dark centuries during which warp storms had cut off Terra from the rest of human space, during which humanity had suffered alien invasion and internal collapse, and the specific horror of being a psychically awakening species with no framework for managing that awakening, was ending. The storms were subsiding. It was time. The Emperor emerged from whatever anonymity he had maintained during the Age of Strife and began the Unification Wars, the campaign to unite Terra's warring nations under his authority before launching outward into the galaxy. The Unification Wars were brutal and necessary and successful. The technology that had survived the Age of Strife was mobilized. The military traditions that had persisted were formalized. Terra was brought to heel. And then the Emperor built his sons. The Primarchs, 20 beings, created from the Emperor's own genetic material, elevated beyond ordinary human capability in every measurable dimension, each one a unique expression of a different aspect of human excellence. Warriors, strategists, philosophers, craftsmen, rulers, each one intended to lead a Space Marine Legion, a vast army of transhuman soldiers who carried the Primarch's own gene seed, who were in some biological sense his descendants. The Primarchs were not simply great soldiers. They were divine in a way that the setting takes seriously. Beings whose presence warped the world around them, whose charisma could inspire absolute loyalty in ordinary mortals, whose capabilities in battle placed them beyond the reach of almost anything the galaxy could produce against them. To see a Primarch fight was to see something that the ordinary categories of combat could not adequately describe. The Chaos Gods, watching from their realm in the warp, understood what the Emperor was building. They could not destroy the Primarchs in their gestation tanks. The Emperor's protections were too strong for that, so they did what the forces of chaos do. They interfered. They opened a portal into the laboratory where the Primarchs were gestating and scattered them across the galaxy. 20 infant demigods hurled through the warp to land on 20 different worlds, human inhabited worlds, all of them, though the Chaos Gods had made sure of that too. Each one would be raised in the environment of the world they landed on. Each one would develop in isolation from the Emperor's plan, becoming whoever the world they landed on made them, before being found and brought back into the project their father had intended for them. The Chaos Gods touched each of those who would eventually turn. Not a corruption that could be detected, not a mark that would be obvious, but a shard of influence planted in the soul of a child, to grow slowly over decades until the moment it was needed. The Emperor, when he discovered what had happened, did not stop. He built the Space Marine legions from the genetic material he still had. Each legion created from the gene seed of the Primarch, it would eventually be given to. And he launched the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade, 200 years, across 1 million worlds, the Emperor's armies, Space Marine legions, armies of ordinary soldiers called the Imperial Army, the war machines of the Mechanicum of Mars, swept through the galaxy in an expanding wave of conquest. The official ideology was the imperial truth. There are no gods. There is no supernatural. There is only the material universe and the specific supremacy of human reason and will. Religion was forbidden in the Imperium the Emperor was building. The warp existed. The Space Marines fought demons. Navigators traveled through it. Psychers drew on its power. But the Emperor insisted that these were phenomena to be understood and managed scientifically, not worshipped. The age of gods was over. The age of humanity was beginning. One by one he found his sons. Each encounter was different. Horus Lupercal had grown up on a feudal world and become a warrior king, beloved by his people, a natural leader of extraordinary charisma. The Emperor found him and recognized something in him immediately. Not just capability, but the specific quality of command that made others better simply by being near it. Robert Gilliman had built an empire on Macragge, not simply conquered his home world, but organized it into a functioning, a prosperous civilization with detailed governance and administrative structures that the Emperor immediately recognized as the template for the Imperium he was trying to build. Ferrus Manus on Medusa, whose hands had been transformed to living metal by an encounter with a silver serpent, whose people were the most technically capable human culture the Crusade had encountered. Sanguinius of Baal, winged, angelically beautiful, beloved with a specific quality of devotion that his people directed at him not as a conqueror, but as something they perceived as genuinely divine. He was the most beloved of all the Primarchs, the one whose specific quality of grace made even his brothers love him in ways they might not have been able to fully articulate. Leman Russ I found leading a tribe that treated him as a supernatural being because he had been raised by wolves, literally, and had the specific feral quality of someone who had grown up in an environment that did not distinguish between survival and violence. Magnus the Red on Prospero, a world of scholars and psychers, the most powerful psychic among all the Primarchs, red-skinned with a single eye, whose relationship to the warp was deeper and more instinctive than the Emperor's guidelines around psychic power were designed to accommodate. Lorgar Aurelian, who had grown up building temples to the Emperor before he had even met him, who worshipped his father as a god from a position of genuine theological conviction, and who would be publicly humiliated and ordered to stop when the Emperor discovered this, and because the imperial truth had no room for a son who believed his father was divine, Angron, found in the middle of a last stand, fighting against impossible odds with a group of gladiatorial slaves, all of whom were about to die. The Emperor arrived in time to save Angron, and only Angron, transporting him away from the battle before his companions could be rescued. Angron never forgave this. He wanted to die alongside the people who had fought beside him. The Emperor took that away from him, and Angron carried in his skull the butcher's nails, psycho-surgical implants that the gladiatorial culture had used on their fighters, that amplified aggression by causing constant low-grade pain, that were slowly killing him from the inside, and that the Emperor's best minds could not remove without killing him. And Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, had grown up on a world of total darkness, whose culture was organized around cruelty and predation. He had brought order to it through terror, the specific governance of a being who understood that the most effective deterrent was making people afraid of what happened to those who transgressed. He was one of the darkest of the Primarchs in ways that the Great Crusade would reveal were more than aesthetic. The two whose names are not spoken, the two whose legions were disbanded and whose records were expunged from history during the Great Crusade before the heresy began. What happened to the two lost Primarchs is one of Warhammer 40k's most carefully maintained mysteries. The hints scattered through the lore suggest something that the Imperium could not acknowledge. Their names are not recorded. Their legions no longer exist. The reasons are not confirmed. The Warmaster. At the height of the Great Crusade, with most of the galaxy brought under Imperial control, the Emperor made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He appointed Horus as Warmaster. The Warmaster, Supreme Commander of all Imperial military forces, the authority over every legion and every campaign, the Emperor's chosen representative in the prosecution of the remaining conquests. No Primarch had ever held this rank. Most of them had opinions about who should. Some agreed that Horus deserved it. His military record was exceptional. His relationship with his brothers was genuinely warm. His ability to hold the complex coalition of Primarchs together was real and recognized. Guilliman might have been a better administrator. Russ might have been a fiercer warrior in single combat. But Horus understood people in ways that made him uniquely suited to the role. Others resented it. Not all of them would say so directly. Resentment in beings of this magnitude is rarely simple or clean. And then the Emperor returned to Terra. He announced that his work on the Great Crusade was complete enough to leave to Horus, that he had a different and more important project to pursue on Terra, and that he would no longer be leading campaigns personally. He did not tell Horus, did not tell any of his sons, what the project was. The Webway. The Emperor was trying to build a human-controlled section of the Eldar's ancient network of tunnels through the Immaterium, a way for humanity to travel between stars without relying on the warp and the navigators who steered through it. If it worked, it would free humanity from the specific vulnerability of warp travel. If it worked, it would change everything. He said none of this. He simply left. His sons watched their father go. Some were fine with it. Some understood that the Emperor operated on a scale that made explaining everything impractical. Some felt abandoned by a father they had never fully had, by a figure who was simultaneously the reason for their existence and a presence that remained fundamentally distant. Horus, who had been given everything and trusted with everything, stood in command of the Great Crusade and wondered why, if his father trusted him with all of this, his father could not trust him with the truth of why he had gone. That question, the specific wound of a beloved son who feels that love without understanding it, was what Chaos found when it went looking for a way in. Sleep well. The corruption is coming, but not yet. For now, the Great Crusade continues. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Lorgar and the First Betrayal. The Horus Heresy did not begin with Horus. It began years earlier, with a public humiliation and a faith destroyed. Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, was the most devout of the Emperor's sons. Where others saw the Emperor as a father figure, a commander, a genetic creator, Lorgar saw something more. A god walking among men, the divine made flesh, the greatest being in the known universe worthy of absolute religious devotion. He built temples, he spread the faith, he slowed the Word-Bearers' progress through the Great Crusade, because every world they brought into compliance, they did properly. They built shrines, they established religious orders, they gave the populations something to believe in rather than simply something to obey. And the Emperor knew about this. He had been tolerating it while the Great Crusade needed the Word-Bearers' capabilities. When he decided to stop tolerating it, he did so in a way that Lorgar never recovered from. He arrived at Monarchia, a world the Word-Bearers had been working on for years, a city they had built as a monument to the Emperor's divinity, the most elaborate expression of Lorgar's faith made architectural. The Emperor arrived with the Ultramarines and ordered Monarchia razed to the ground, while Lorgar and the entire Word-Bearers Legion knelt in the dust and watched it burn. Then the Emperor told Lorgar, in terms that were not ambiguous, that he was not a god, that worship was not what was required, that the Word-Bearers had wasted the decades they could have been conquering, for a being whose entire existence was organized around faith. This was not simply a reprimand. It was the specific destruction of everything that had made his life meaningful. Lorgar knelt in the dust of Monarchia and understood that the thing he had worshipped was telling him his worship was wrong. He went looking for something that would accept his devotion. He found the Chaos Gods. Lorgar spent years in the Eye of Terror with his most trusted lieutenants, Corferon and Erebus, learning the truth of the warp, establishing contact with the ruinous powers, and pledging the Word-Bearers to their service. He became the first Chaos Space Marine, and then he and Erebus began working on a plan that would take decades to execute. The corruption of the Warmaster. Erebus, the hand of destiny. Erebus is one of the most genuinely sinister figures in the Horus Heresy. Not because he is the most powerful, but because of the specific quality of his intelligence. He understood that to bring down the Imperium, you did not need to attack its strongest point. You needed to find the right point. He had grown up on Colchis, Lorgar's homeworld, a place of fervent religious tradition. As a young man, he had murdered a rival priest and stolen his identity, taking his name and his tattoos. He had been Erebus in name only, having killed the original. This is presented in the lore not as backstory, but as character definition. A man who achieved his position through murder and deception, who wore another person's identity so completely that no one knew he was not the person he claimed to be. When the Emperor arrived on Colchis, Erebus was the only person who was not overwhelmed by the Emperor's divine presence. He felt exhilaration. He saw the man he would someday bring low. His plan for Horus was long and patient. He spread warrior lodges through the Space Marine legions, secret fraternal societies, modelled on the customs of Davin, presented as morale-building brotherhoods. In reality, they were a network of potential corruption, spaces within the legions where loyalty to each other grew stronger than loyalty to the Emperor, where chaos influence could be introduced gradually. Not all Space Marines joined the lodges. Those who refused, who saw them as exactly what they were, violations of the Emperor's requirement for openness and transparency within his armies, were correct, but enough joined. Or he stole an artifact called the Anatham from an alien civilization called the Interrex, precipitating a war between the Interrex and the Imperium in the process, a war that need not have happened. The Anatham was a weapon with a specific property. Wounds it inflicted could not be healed by conventional means. Wounds that would touch the soul as well as the body. He gave the Anatham to the corrupted governor of a world called Davin, and then he arranged for Horus to go to Davin personally. The Moon of Davin. Horus arrived on Davin's moon to bring a rebellious governor back to imperial compliance. The governor, Eugen Temba, a man who had been given his position by Horus himself years earlier and who had been corrupted by chaos in the interim, was waiting. The fight was not difficult by the standards of what Horus was capable of, but Temba was wielding the Anatham. The wound did not close. Horus's enhanced physiology, the specific biological capability of a Primarch, which was designed to heal damage that would kill ordinary humans, could not address whatever the Anatham had done. The wound festered. He weakened. His legion's apothecaries could not find a solution. His sons watched their Primarch dying and could not stop it. Erebus provided the suggestion, a ritual at the Serpent Lodge on Davin's moon, a local tradition with a reputation for healing. The warrior lodge members within Horus's forces, the ones Erebus had been cultivating, supported this. The legion's most devoted members, driven by the specific desperation of watching someone they loved die from something they could not fight, agreed. They did not know what they were agreeing to. In the warp. During the ritual, Horus's consciousness was carried into the warp. What he experienced there was not random. It was curated. Erebus was present in the vision, wearing the face of Hastur Sejanus, one of Horus's oldest and most trusted companions, who had died years earlier. The face of a dead friend, used by an enemy as a mask, explaining the truth of the universe to the Warmaster while he lay dying. And the Chaos Gods showed him the future. What they showed him was real, in the specific way that chaos deception works best. Not lies, but truths arranged to produce a specific conclusion. The future they showed him was a future where the Emperor was worshipped as a god, which was correct, because the Emperor's specific project of suppressing religion had already failed and would continue to fail. And the Imperium that would exist 10,000 years hence would be a theocracy organized around his divinity. The future they showed him was a future where the Primarchs had been forgotten, their contributions to the Great Crusade effaced by the weight of the religious mythology that would grow up around the Emperor. They showed him Horus himself, unremarked, forgotten in the shadow of a deified father. And then they offered him an alternative. Not this future, a different future. One where Horus replaced the Emperor, where the Primarchs held the galaxy and were not forgotten but celebrated, where the galaxy was ruled by those who had actually conquered it, rather than a single figure who would be elevated beyond accountability. What the Chaos Gods did not show him, what their version of that future actually looked like, what it meant for the civilization they were offering to build, what serving the ruinous powers eventually produces in beings who give them their devotion. They showed him the grievance, real, legitimate, and offered a resolution without showing him the cost. Magnus the Red was also present in the vision. Magnus, whose relationship to the warp was deeper than any of his brothers, who could see more truly in this space than the most beings could, opposed Erebus's manipulation. He argued against what Horus was being shown. He tried to pull his brother back. He failed. Horus accepted the offer of the Chaos Gods. In exchange, he was healed. The wound closed. The Primarch, who had been dying, woke up in the Serpent Lodge on Davin's moon, intact, functional, and fundamentally changed. He was no longer the Emperor's most beloved son. He was the instrument of 4 divine powers, whose goal was the destruction of everything the Emperor had built. The Mask. What Horus did next is one of the most chilling aspects of the lore. He was very good at pretending nothing had changed. The Great Crusade continued. Horus continued to command it. He worked alongside his brothers, the loyal ones who had no idea, and performed the role of Warmaster with the specific competence that had made him the Warmaster. The legions that were already corrupted, the word-bearers who had been working toward this for decades, Lorga and Corferon and Erebus, who had arranged everything, knew. The others did not. He spent years building his coalition, not through crude threats or obvious corruption, but through the specific understanding of his brothers that his charisma and decades of shared experience had given him. He knew which ones could be reached. He knew which ones could not. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, who had encountered a demon weapon called the Layer Blade that was slowly possessing him, feeding his innate perfectionism until it became something Slanesh could work with. Mortarion of the Death Guard, whose first captain, Callus Typhon, had been carefully preparing the ground for years. Angron of the World Eaters, whose rage and the butcher's nails and the specific grief of a man the Emperor had taken from the death he wanted, had already made him ready for something to direct his violence toward. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, who had spent the Great Crusade given the hardest siege assignments and the worst postings, who felt used rather than valued, who had a grudge that Horus knew how to open. The loyal Primarchs, Guilliman, Sanguinius, the Lion, Rogel Dawn, were too dangerous to approach and too perceptive to deceive for long. Horus arranged for them to be elsewhere when it mattered. Separate campaigns, distant theatres, missions that would keep them occupied until the moment he was ready. He was very, very good at this. The Emperor, in his webway project on Terra, continued his work. His communications with the Great Crusade grew less frequent. His attention was on the thing he was building. He trusted Horus. He did not know what he was trusting. The numbers. When Horus had finished his quiet work, the numbers were as follows. 9 Primarchs and their legions had been turned or secured. 9 Primarchs and their legions remained loyal. 2 were accounted for separately. The Alpha Legion's Alpharius had made a calculation of his own, joining Horus after receiving a prophecy that Horus's victory would ultimately destroy the Chaos Gods, a claim whose accuracy the law deliberately leaves ambiguous. 9 against 9. The greatest military force in human history divided exactly in half. What Horus needed, before he revealed himself, was to destroy enough of the loyal side that what remained could not stop him. He had a plan for this too, a world called Isstvan III, and a planet called Isstvan V. Sleep well. The heresy is about to begin in the open, and when it does, nothing will be the same. Welcome back. Let everything slow. The Coral City. Before Horus could declare his rebellion openly, he had a problem. His legions, the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, were not entirely corrupted. The process of turning Primarchs had not extended to every Space Marine in every legion. There were loyal Space Marines in the traitor legions, men who had served faithfully throughout the Great Crusade, who had not been reached by the warrior lodges, who remained devoted to the Emperor regardless of what their commanders had decided. If Horus went to war with these men in his ranks, he was going to war with enemies behind his own lines. He needed to remove them. The planetary governor of Isstvan III had rebelled against the Imperium, a convenient crisis and whose origins involved chaos corruption that Horus was certainly aware of. The Emperor and the Council of Terra, unaware of what Horus had become, assigned him to handle it. Horus brought his 4 turned legions to the Isstvan system and prepared to do 2 things simultaneously: resolve the planetary rebellion and murder his own loyal Space Marines. The loyal elements of the 4 legions, perhaps 100,000 Space Marines who had been identified as too trustworthy to be allowed to survive, were deployed to Isstvan III, specifically to the Coral City, the planetary capital, not in Stormbirds, which would have allowed them to maintain communication with the fleet. In drop pods, their communication lines were cut immediately after they landed. They fought the planetary rebellion. They were good at it. They were Space Marines, and planetary rebels, however corrupted, were not a significant military challenge by those standards. The Coral City began to fall. The Loyalists expected reinforcement from the fleet. What came from the fleet was not reinforcement. The Life Eater. The virus bombs descended on the Coral City while the battle was still being fought. The Life Eater virus was exactly what its name suggested: a biological weapon of extraordinary lethality, designed to kill every living organism it touched. The 12 billion inhabitants of Isstvan III, the planetary rebels, the Imperial forces on the ground, all of them exposed to something that consumed life itself and left only toxic gas. 2 Space Marines knew what was coming. Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard had received warning from a source in the fleet. Haran had managed to warn Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's children, who commandeered a gunship and flew to the surface at personal risk to warn as many loyalists as he could reach. The loyalist Space Marines, warned with minutes to spare, sealed themselves in bunkers and catacomb networks. Their bodies, transhumanly resistant, their power armor providing additional protection, survived what 12 billion ordinary humans did not. Horus, monitoring from orbit, learned that significant numbers had survived. He ordered a conventional bombardment, incendiary weapons to ignite the toxic gases that the Life Eater had produced, turning Isstvan III into a world-spanning firestorm. The cities burned, the hives melted, the death toll among the civilian population and most unprotected life on the planet was absolute. The bunkers held Iron Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, whose specific relationship to patience was adversarial, did not want to wait for a second orbital bombardment to finish the job. Against Horus's orders, he personally led 50 companies of World Eaters to the surface of Isstvan III to kill the survivors himself. What followed was months of brutal urban warfare in a burning, toxic ruin of a world. The loyal Space Marines, who knew they were dead men, who knew there was no rescue coming, who had decided that the only thing left to them was making the betrayal cost as much as possible, fought with the specific ferocity of people who have nothing left to lose except the fighting. They held, they bled the traitors. They made Horus pay for every street and every bunker. They killed traitor Space Marines in numbers that Horus had not anticipated. And then they were destroyed. Eventually, completely, the loyalists of Isstvan III were killed. Some by bombardment from orbit, when even Horus's patience ended. Some by the World Eaters and the other traitor forces. Some by the toxic environment of the world they were defending. The last of them died fighting. Nathaniel Garrow did not wait to die with them. With a small group of loyal Space Marines and several important civilians, including a woman named Euphrati Keeler, who was becoming something that the Imperial Truth said could not exist, and a man named Kirill Sinderman, who had witnessed Horus's massacre of the fleet's remembrancers. Garrow commandeered a Death Guard frigate called the Eisenstein. The ship escaped the Isstvan system and fled into the warp. Their destination, Terra. Their mission, to warn the Emperor. Garrow reached Terra. He told Rogal Dorn, the Primarch who served as the Emperor's Praetorian, whose legion defended the Imperial Palace, what had happened at Isstvan III. Dorn did not want to believe it. He could not afford not to. He sent a fleet. The trap on Isstvan fell, 7 legions. The Emperor dispatched 7 full Space Marine legions to confront Horus in the Isstvan system, the largest loyalist force ever assembled for a single engagement. Rogal Dorn organized the response, selecting the commanding Primarchs, deploying them in 2 waves to ensure maximum effect. The first wave, 3 legions. The Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon, whose hands had been transformed to living metal, who had one of the most exceptional military records of the Great Crusade, who had been a close friend of Horus before Davin, and who had not yet learned to distrust him. He was chosen as field commander. The Salamanders under Vulcan, the most gentle of the Primarchs, whose legions specialized in flame weapons, and whose culture on Nocturne valued protection of the innocent, above all other military virtues. The Raven Guard under Corvus Corax, a legion of shadow and silence, whose doctrine emphasized speed and precision and the specific warfare of beings who strike without warning. These 3 legions made planetfall on Isstvan V. They fought with extraordinary effectiveness against Horus's prepared positions. They drove the traitors back. They pushed into the Urgal Depression, the great killing ground where Horus had concentrated his forces. They took losses, but they were winning. Then they called for the second wave. The second wave, 4 legions. The Iron Warriors under Prospero, the master of siege warfare, who had spent the Great Crusade being given the hardest assignments and who had decided, somewhere in those years, that the Emperor valued him as a siege tool rather than as a son. The Night Lords under Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, who had been disciplined by the Emperor for the excessive terror of his methods and who had never forgiven what he perceived as ingratitude. The Alpha Legion under Alpharius, the most opaque of all the Primarchs, whose legion's approach to everything involved layers of deception that made even other Space Marines uncertain of their intentions. A significant force of word-bearers, Lorga's Legion, the first corrupted, the most committed. These 4 legions, in orbit above Isstvan III, were supposed to reinforce the first wave when the Loyalists signaled for them. They opened fire on the Loyalists instead. The Dropsite Massacre. The Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard, pushing forward in the certainty of reinforcement, found themselves caught between 8 hostile legions. In front of them, Horus's original forces. Behind them, 4 legions whose betrayal no one had anticipated. The killing ground of the Urgal Depression became exactly that. A killing ground, undefined not by terrain, but by the specific geometry of a perfectly executed ambush. The Loyalists fought back. They always fought back. This is what Space Marines are. But the mathematics of the situation were absolute. 3 legions against 8, surrounded, on ground chosen by the enemy, with reserves that had just revealed themselves as enemies. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, sought out Fulgrim, his brother, his friend, the Primarch he had known before the corruption, who had visited him on Medusa and been welcomed as family. Fulgrim had been one of the earliest corrupted, his descent driven by a demon weapon called the Lair Blade that had been slowly possessing him, feeding his perfectionism until Slaanesh could work with what remained. They fought as only Primarchs can fight, at a scale and intensity beyond ordinary combat. Divine beings whose specific natures expressed themselves in everything from the way they moved to the weapons they chose. Fulgrim, fully corrupted, wielded everything the demon blade had given him. Ferrus Manus, who could not believe his friend was truly gone, hesitated. Fulgrim beheaded him. The Primarch of the Iron Hands died on the black sands of Isstvan III, his head taken by his brother. The specific tragedy of this, the specific cost of not being able to accept that someone you loved had chosen to become what they had become, is one of the defining moments of the heresy. Ferrus Manus died because he still saw Fulgrim. Vulcan of the Salamanders fought on the left flank until the position collapsed. He was not killed. Vulcan was a perpetual, one of the extraordinarily rare humans whose soul could not truly die, who would simply wake again somewhere after apparent death. He was captured by Conrad Kurz, who would spend months torturing him in ways designed to test whether a being who could not die could still be broken. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard, realizing the situation was beyond recovery, organized the retreat. He fought a personal combat with Lorga himself, and nearly killed the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, who was saved only by Conrad Kurz's intervention. Corax escaped with a fraction of his legion. The shadows that had always been his element became the escape route when everything else failed. 90% of the loyalist forces deployed to Isstvan III were lost. 3 entire legions, forces that had taken decades to build, gene seed cultures that had been maintained since the Great Crusade's beginning, were effectively destroyed in a single day. The shattered legions, as the survivors would be called, scattered across the galaxy in small war bands. They continued to fight. They never stopped fighting. But as guerrilla forces, as desperate remnants, as people doing what they could in the aftermath of a catastrophe that had removed their ability to mount anything like a conventional military response. The heresy in the open. Horus had achieved what he needed. 9 legions against what was effectively 6. 3 reduced to remnants, and the rest distributed across a galaxy in which the warp was becoming increasingly hostile to Imperial travel, as the heresy's psychic violence fed the ruinous powers. The Isstvan system had told the Imperium something it had not wanted to know. The war had already begun, and it had begun with the enemy already inside the house. What happened next was simultaneous catastrophe across multiple fronts. The burning of Prospero, Leman Russ sent to detain Magnus the Red, and arriving with fire instead of justice, destroying the Thousand Sons' homeworld through a combination of Horus's manipulation of the Wolves' orders and the political decisions of a dozen parties who all chose wrong. Magnus, who had tried to warn the Emperor through forbidden sorcery and had broken the Emperor's Webway project in the attempt, fled with his surviving sons into the warp, becoming, through grief and the chaos that had claimed the remnant of his legion, a servant of Tzeentch, despite never intending to be. The Battle of Calth, the Word-Bearers ambushing the Ultramarines under the cover of what was supposed to be a joint muster, killing Ultramarines in numbers that would have been impossible in open warfare, deploying demonic forces on a world that had never known such things, corrupting its sun through a ritual that bathed the planet in lethal radiation. The Ruin Storm, a massive warp phenomenon generated by the Word-Bearers' ritual at Calth, cutting enormous sections of the galaxy off from reliable warp travel, separating the largest loyal legions from Terra, precisely when Terra needed them most. Horus had a clear path to Terra. He took years rather than months, consolidating, reinforcing, allowing the Chaos Gods to strengthen his forces, giving time for the loyalist response to be scattered and disrupted. But the path was open. Sleep well. The march to Terra has begun, and at the end of it, the Emperor is waiting. Welcome back. Let everything slow. 7 years. Between the Dropsite Massacre of Isstvan V and the arrival of Horus's fleet at Terra, 7 years passed. 7 years during which the heresy spread across the galaxy like a fire that had found a wind. Horus did not simply march on Terra immediately. He was methodical in a way that his military genius demanded. He needed to consolidate the territory he had taken. He needed to allow the Chaos Gods to strengthen his forces through the specific processes of corruption and demonic empowerment that required time. He needed to ensure that the loyalist legions who had not been destroyed were isolated, too far away, too disrupted by the ruin storm and the warp's increasing hostility to organized travel, to arrive at Terra before the siege had determined the outcome. The Shadow Crusade happened during these years. Lorgar's Word-Bearers and Angron's World Eaters devastating Ultramar. Guilliman's realm, the domain of the largest surviving loyalist legion, burning world after world in a ritual designed not simply to destroy, but to feed the ruin storm, making the section of the galaxy containing Ultramar and several other loyalist forces inaccessible to reliable warp travel. Angron, during the Shadow Crusade, was elevated to Demon Prince by Khorne. The butcher's nails that had been killing him slowly for his entire life were consumed in the transformation, replaced by something worse and more permanent. Divinity in the service of the blood god, the specific apotheosis of a being whose entire existence had been organized around violence and pain. He did not become more than he had been. He became entirely what he had always been becoming. The burning of Prospero had happened. Magnus the Red and his surviving 1,000 sons, their homeworld destroyed, had fled into the Eye of Terror and found themselves on the planet of the sorcerers, a demon world under Tzeentch's direct influence. Magnus, who had tried to warn the Emperor and had broken the Webway project in the attempt, who had watched his sons destroyed by the Space Wolves in an attack ordered through Horus's manipulation of the political situation, found that the only refuge available to him was the service of the god who had already claimed his legion. He had not chosen chaos. Chaos had arranged the situation such that refusing it meant extinction. The ruin storm was maintained by these sacrifices. Entire worlds burned, and billions killed in rituals that fed the warp and strengthened the psychic barrier cutting the galaxy in half. Robert Guilliman, with 3 Primarchs and their legions isolated in Ultramar, made the decision that would haunt him for the next 10,000 years. He declared Imperium Secundus, a second Imperium, in Ultramar, designed to preserve human civilization in the event that Terra had already fallen. His reasoning was sound. His information was incomplete. While he was building a contingency civilization, Terra was still standing and screaming for reinforcements that could not reach it because of the storm that had been specifically designed to prevent them. When the ruin storm finally broke, when Guilliman's forces found their way through, they were hours away from Terra. Hours, and when the siege had lasted months and the outcome was already being decided on the bridge of Horus's flagship. The Solar War. Before Horus's forces could reach Terra, they had to fight through the Sol system itself. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terra, whose specific genius was fortification and defensive warfare, had spent the years of the heresy preparing the Imperial Palace and the entire Sol system for the siege he knew was coming. Every fortress that could be strengthened was strengthened. Every orbital defense that could be built was built. The Imperial Palace became the most heavily fortified location in the history of mankind. It was not enough to stop Horus reaching Terra. It was enough to make reaching Terra cost him enormously. the Solar War, the campaign through the Sol system before the siege began, was fought in space and on the moons and stations of the outer system. Loyalist and traitor naval forces engaged in engagements whose scale dwarfed anything the Great Crusade had produced. The specific calculation Dawn had made, that he could not prevent the siege but could ensure the siege was as costly as possible, buying time for the distant legions to return, played out over months of desperate fighting. Horus reached Terra. The siege began. The siege. The scale of what descended on Terra is difficult to render in ordinary language. 9 traitor legions, countless regiments of fallen Imperial army, Titan legions, the enormous war machines of the Mechanicum, hundreds of meters tall, unarmed with weapons capable of destroying fortifications that had taken years to build. Demonic forces called up from the warp by the rituals that the years of the Shadow Crusade had been feeding. The full concentrated violence of 4 chaos gods, expressing itself through every corrupted warrior and demon and engine that had devoted itself to their service. Against this, the Imperial Palace, the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the White Scars, the Adeptus Custodes, 1.5 million soldiers of the Imperial Army, 4 loyalist Titan legions, and the Sisters of Silence, whose specific gift was the negation of psychic power, and the Emperor himself, in the depths of the palace, maintaining the Golden Throne and the machinery of the Webway project, because the alternative, leaving the Webway project unattended, was having the demons that the broken Webway had admitted into the Imperial Palace pour through into Terra proper. The siege lasted months. The traitor forces advanced, foot by foot, against defenders who gave everything and never stopped. Sanguinius, the great angel, the most beloved of the Primarchs, who had been warned by visions of his own death on the vengeful spirit, and had chosen to come anyway, commanded the palace's defense with the specific combination of military genius and visible nobility that made ordinary mortals want to follow him into situations they should not survive. Ungron, elevated to Demon Prince, crashed from the sky like a divine weapon of destruction. He killed everything he encountered. Sanguinius met him at the Eternity Wall and faced him without flinching, and told his fallen brother that today was not the day, then held the wall while Angron raged. The defenders held longer than anyone had a right to expect. Then the walls began to fall. Horus lowers his shields. Near the end of the siege, something happened that the Imperial records dispute in its motivation, but agree upon in its occurrence. Horus lowered the void shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. The void shields were the specific protection that kept the enormous warship from being destroyed by loyalist weapons. Lowering them was making the flagship vulnerable. Why Horus did this is one of the heresy's most debated questions. Whether it was a moment of genuine regret, a private acknowledgement that some part of him wanted the Emperor to come and end what he had started, or simply a supremely confident challenge, the Warmaster saying, "Come to me, and let us finish this face to face." Whatever the reason, the Emperor accepted. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's oldest friend, the being who had served him since before the Unification Wars, the second most powerful human psychic alive, took the Emperor's place on the Golden Throne. He knew what this meant. Sitting on the Golden Throne without the Emperor's divine constitution sustaining the user killed ordinary humans within hours. Malcador was extraordinary, not ordinary, but he was still mortal in ways the Emperor was not. He sat down. He understood he was choosing to die for this. He sat down anyway. The Emperor teleported to the vengeful spirit with Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, the Custodies, and companies of Imperial Fists and Blood Angels. The teleportation scattered them across the demon-corrupted warship. The vengeful spirit was no longer simply a vessel. The Chaos Gods had transformed it during the years of the heresy into something that existed partially in the warp. A space where the ordinary laws of physics were suggestions and the horrors of the immaterium were walking the corridors. Each fragment of the assault force fought their way through the ship separately. They fought demons and corrupted space marines and the specific horrors that a ship partially consumed by the warp produces. Sanguinius reached Horus first. The death of the angel. He knew he was going to die, so he had seen it. The prophetic visions that came to him throughout the heresy had shown him this moment with enough clarity that there was no reasonable doubt about the outcome. He had told the Emperor. He had insisted on coming anyway, because the specific conviction that shaped his character held that the knowledge of a terrible fate was not a reason to avoid it. It was a reason to face it directly, with his eyes open, doing whatever damage he could before the end. Horus offered him a place at his side, one last time, to the brother he had loved most among all his brothers. The Warmaster offered the alternative. Join this and be part of what comes after. Sanguinius refused. He fought, already wounded from months of siege, from his battle with Kabanda the daemon, and from everything the defense of the Imperial Palace had taken from him. He fought the Warmaster with everything he had, and he damaged Horus. The accounts suggest he cracked the Warmaster's armor in a specific place, a flaw in the protection that Chaos had woven around him, a small wound in an otherwise invulnerable position. Horus killed him. The great angel, the noblest of the Primarchs, the one that all his brothers loved, died on the bridge of the vengeful spirit. When the Emperor reached that bridge and found Sanguinius's body at Horus's feet, the Imperial records describe something that almost never happened to the Emperor. Speechlessness. A moment of grief so complete that the being who had maintained his purpose across thousands of years could not, for a moment, find words. Horus spoke for him. He proclaimed himself the rightful ruler of humanity. He said he had bound the Chaos Gods to his will. He mocked his father and the dream the Great Crusade had represented. The Emperor told him the truth. Horus had become the slave of chaos, not its master. Horus had never been in control of anything that had happened since Davin. He had been the instrument of the ruinous powers, not their ally. Horus attacked. The duel. What happened in that chamber cannot be fully described. Two divine beings, one who had grown beyond the human and into something the word God is insufficient to name. One who had been made as a weapon to conquer galaxies and had given himself to four divine powers simultaneously, fighting in a space that was partly no longer physical. The Emperor could not use his full power. The reason is debated. In some accounts say he held back because Horus was still somewhere inside the corruption, his son, that some part of him could not destroy completely what he had made, that the specific love a father has for a child even a child who has chosen everything the father stands against does not simply stop. Other accounts say the Emperor's restraint was tactical, that using his full divine power in a vessel that existed partially in the warp risked a catastrophic release that would have destroyed the ship and everyone on it. The result of this restraint, Horus nearly killed him. The Warmaster, with 4 chaos gods pouring their divine power into him, with the specific enhancements that years of service to the ruinous powers had accumulated, with the grief and rage and divine power that the deaths of the Great Crusade had fed, brought the Emperor to the edge of death. More than the edge. Rogel Dawn, arriving after the battle, found his father's body and could not find a way to believe it still lived. In the moment before the end, the moment when the Emperor was dying and had nothing left, something shifted. The sight of what Horus had become, what the corruption had made of his most beloved son, was enough. The grief resolved into something else. The Emperor stopped holding back. The blast of pure psychic power that followed burned through Horus completely, not simply killed. The soul was destroyed, not simply dispersed. Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the Sons of Horus, Warmaster of the Great Crusade, favoured son of the Emperor of Mankind, he ceased to exist in any form that could endure. In the moment before the end, as the Chaos Gods abandoned him and his mind cleared, Horus was himself again. The accounts say he begged his father to finish it, knowing what would happen if the Chaos Gods reclaimed him. The Emperor did. The Golden Throne. Rogel Dawn found his father breathing, barely. Malkador was dying. The Golden Throne had done exactly what sitting on it without the Emperor's constitution guaranteed it would do. He had held on long enough. He died as the Emperor was carried back to the throne. The Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne, not as a temporary measure. His body was too damaged to survive without it, and the psychic infrastructure that the Golden Throne maintained, the Astronomicon, the beacon that guided warp travel across the Imperium, the barrier that held the webway breach closed, could not be abandoned. He has been there ever since. The heresy was over. The traitor legions, with Horus dead, and the specific divine power that had been flowing through him suddenly withdrawn, broke and fled. They ran for the Eye of Terror, the great warp anomaly where the boundary between the material universe and the warp is thinnest, where chaos holds permanent dominion. They took their corrupted ships and their demon allies and the specific remnants of what had once been the greatest military force the Imperium had produced. Rogel Dawn organized the pursuit, the Great Scouring, which hounded them through the years that followed. The traitor homeworlds were destroyed. The records of the heresy were suppressed, reclassified, hidden, partly to prevent panic, partly to maintain the specific fiction that the Imperium needed to function. The scale of what had happened was too large to be fully acknowledged. What was left? The Emperor on the Golden Throne is the defining image of Warhammer 40,000, a god neither fully alive nor fully dead, sustained by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers, maintaining through sheer divine will the psychic infrastructure of an Imperium that he can no longer lead. Whether he is aware, whether he is suffering, whether he has a plan. These are the questions that the setting holds open across 10,000 years of subsequent history. The imperial cult, the religion that worships him as a god. The very thing he explicitly forbade during the Great Crusade has grown up around the Golden Throne. The Imperium that exists in the 41st millennium is the theocracy that the imperial truth was designed to prevent, organized around faith in a divine emperor who cannot speak to confirm or deny the doctrines being built in his name. Horus had been shown in the visions on Davin a future where the emperor was worshipped as a god. The Chaos gods showed him this as the reason to rebel, this terrible future where divinity replaced reason. He rebelled. The rebellion produced exactly that future. The Imperium of the 41st millennium, the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war, is the direct consequence of the Horus Heresy. Every aspect of what the setting is flows from what happened on Davin's moon, at Isstvan III, at Isstvan V, at Calth and Prospero, and in the ruins of the Siege of Terra, the institution of the Inquisition, the breaking of the legions into chapters, the fanatical religion, the specific brutality of an imperium that has spent 10,000 years fighting to survive what the heresy began. Sanguinius died, Malcador died, Ferris Manus died. The emperor sits on the Golden Throne. The traitor Primarchs, those who were not elevated to demon princes, rage in the eye of terror, or pursue their own agendas across a galaxy that has been paying for 10,000 years for decisions made in a few years of civil war. Sleep well. The dream of the Great Crusade did not survive, but humanity did. And in the 41st millennium, that is enough to keep fighting for. Welcome back. Let everything slow. We are nearly at the end. The Great Scouring. After the Siege of Terra, after Horus was destroyed and the traitor legions broke and fled, the Imperium did something that had not been done since the Great Crusade. It turned the most powerful military forces it still possessed toward a single purpose. The Great Scouring was the systematic pursuit and punishment of every traitor force that had participated in the heresy. The loyal legions, reduced, wounded, carrying the specific exhaustion of beings who had survived a war that had killed demigods, hunted the traitors back through the territory they had taken, back through the heresy's spread, back toward the Eye of Terror. The traitor legions fought as they retreated. They did not simply run. Each world the Scouring reached had its own campaign, its own atrocities and counter-atrocities, its own specific cost in soldiers and civilians and time. Some traitor strongholds held for years. Some worlds that had submitted to Horus's dark empire during the heresy had populations that needed to be dealt with. Populations that had worshipped the Chaos gods, had accepted the alternative Horus had offered, and could not simply be integrated back into the Imperium as if the heresy had not happened. The Scouring ended, eventually, with the traitor legions behind the Eye of Terror's boundary. Not destroyed, they remain in that great warp anomaly, their Primarchs mostly elevated to demon princes or retreating into deep warp sleep, rebuilding in the specific way that beings who cannot truly die in the Eye's environment can rebuild across millennia. The homeworlds of the traitor legions were destroyed or abandoned. Isstvan V was bombarded. The records that the heresy had produced, the accounts of what had happened, the full scope of the betrayal, were classified, suppressed, hidden behind layers of imperial bureaucracy and the specific institutional interest that a state has in not fully acknowledging its most catastrophic failure. The Codex and the breaking of the legions, Robot Guilliman, who had survived, who had watched the Emperor placed on the Golden Throne and understood what this meant for who would govern the Imperium in the immediate aftermath, produced the Codex Astartes. The Codex was his response to the question that the heresy had made unavoidable. How do you prevent this from happening again? How do you ensure that no single commander ever has the military resources of an entire Space Marine Legion to direct toward the destruction of the Imperium? The answer was structural. The legions were broken into smaller units called chapters. Each chapter would be limited to 1,000 Space Marines, a force capable of extraordinary things, but not capable of threatening the Imperium the way that a full legion under a chaos-corrupted Primarch could. The gene seed was distributed. The specific concentration of military power that had made the heresy possible was deliberately eliminated. Some Primarchs agreed, some did not. Leman Russ and Rogul Dawn, in particular, resisted the breaking of their legions. The arguments were fierce, the specific irony not lost on anyone involved. Guilliman, and who had governed his own realm as a contingency Imperium during the heresy, was now imposing his administrative vision on the entire surviving structure of Space Marine military power. The Codex Astartes prevailed. The legions became chapters. The specific concentration of the Great Crusade's military might was permanently dispersed. It has held for 10,000 years. No legion-scale force has threatened the Imperium from within since. This is either because the Codex solved the problem or because the specific conditions that made the heresy possible have not recurred. The question of which is one the setting leaves open. Shouldn't the fates of the Primarchs? What happened to the 18 Primarchs, the 9 loyal and the 9 who turned, is one of the most sprawling and in some cases deliberately incomplete narratives in Warhammer 40,000. The traitor Primarchs, each elevated to Demon Prince status or retreating into the Eye of Terror, became the specific nightmare versions of what they had been. Angron, the Demon Prince of Khorne, who had wanted to die with his companions on a slave planet and been denied, now expresses his rage across 10 millennia in the specific way that a being of divine violence who cannot be stopped, except temporarily, expresses it. He is banished periodically, returns, and continues. Mortarion, whose death guard became the divine instruments of Nurgle's plague, who had feared Psykers his entire life and now is served by the most pestilent forces in the galaxy. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, who killed his closest friend, and who has descended so far into Slanesh's perfection-seeking excess that what he has become is barely recognizable as anything that began as human. Magnus the Red, in his tower on the planet of the sorcerers, surrounded by the surviving knowledge of the Thousand Suns, who was trying to warn the Emperor and ended up as a demon Primarch of Tzeentch through the specific cruelty of circumstances that never gave him a clear choice. The loyal Primarch's fates are, in their own way, equally strange. Rogul Dawn, believed killed during the First Black Crusade in the centuries after the heresy, with only his hands recovered. Whether he truly died or disappeared is a mystery the setting maintains. Leman Russ walked into the Eye of Terror during a feast, leaving behind only a prophecy that he would return for the Wolf Time, the last battle. He has not returned. Not yet. Jagatai Khan disappeared into the webway, pursuing Drakari raiders who had taken Space Wolves prisoners. The web is vast and largely unmapped. He has not come back. Corvus Corax, who survived Isstvan V, with the remnants of his legion, who spent years rebuilding the Raven Guard, eventually departed into the Eye of Terror himself, having become something more than fully human through the specific experiments he undertook in the aftermath of the massacre. He sent back one word, nevermore, and was not seen again. Vulcan, the perpetual who cannot truly die, is somewhere. His sons, the salamanders, await him. He has appeared periodically across 10,000 years and disappeared again. Sanguinius is dead. His body rests on Baal in a golden sarcophagus, but he is not entirely absent. His psychic imprint persists in the gene seed of the Blood Angels, in the specific afflictions of the Black Rage and the Red Thirst that his sons carry as the inheritance of his death, and the specific grief of what the Siege of Terra did to his psyche in his final hours. Every Blood Angel, when they die, sees the world through Sanguinius's eyes in his last moments. They die as he died, reliving the death of the angel so completely that they cannot distinguish themselves from him. Ferrus Manus is dead. His body was not recovered. His head was taken as a trophy by Fulgrim, who eventually discarded it. And the Iron Hands have never entirely forgiven this, in the specific way that a culture organized around the memory of a traumatic loss shapes itself around the wound. Robut Gilliman, wounded by a poisoned blade from the heresy's aftermath, placed in stasis on Macragga for 10,000 years, returned in the 41st millennium by the specific miracle of Iniad's gift through Ivrain. He serves now as Lord Commander of the Imperium, reading 10,000 years of history in the administrative records, working to rebuild what the heresy started destroying and the millennia continued. He is not happy about what the Imperium has become. He is not sure he can fix it. He is doing it anyway. Lion Eljonson, whose Dark Angels spent the heresy in campaigns that kept them conveniently absent from the decisive moments, who returned to Caliban to find his second-in-command Luther had turned traitor, who fought his brother in a duel that destroyed Caliban and left the lion in a sleep beneath the rock. The Dark Angels' fortress monastery has returned. The deepest secret of the Dark Angels is that they spent 10,000 years hunting their own heretics in secret, the fallen Dark Angels who followed Luther, a secret they kept because the alternative was admitting that their legion had its own traitors during the heresy. The two lost Primarchs, whose legions were expunged before the heresy, whose names are not recorded, remain a mystery. The hints suggest that what happened to them was something the Imperium could not acknowledge. The answers, if they exist in the lore, have never been confirmed. The Inquisition. Among the institutions that emerged from the heresy's aftermath, the Inquisition carries the most specific connection to its origins. Nathaniel Garrow, the Death Guard captain who escaped on the Eisenstein, who carried the warning to Terra, who served as Malcador's agent through years of the heresy, hunting traitors and investigating threats, was among the founding members of what became the Inquisition. Kirill Sinderman, who had been the Great Crusade's premier iterator, and who had witnessed Horus's massacre of the civilians on the Vengeful Spirit, I became a founding member of what would eventually be called the Imperial Church. Though at this stage, it was something far less organized. The specific purpose of the Inquisition: to ensure that the heresy's conditions never recur, to watch for corruption from within, to identify chaos cults and psycho threats and alien influence before they become the kind of catastrophe that 9 Primarchs and their legions became, to be, in essence, the institutional expression of the heresy's lesson, that the enemy can wear a friendly face and come from inside the house. 10,000 years later, the Inquisition is something considerably more complex than this. Multiple factions with competing philosophies about what the greatest threats to the Imperium are, how aggressively they should be pursued, how much collateral damage is acceptable in the pursuit of purity, but its origins are specific and traceable to the specific events that made its existence seem necessary. What the heresy made. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is the world the heresy made, and it is not the world the Great Crusade was trying to build. The imperial truth, the atheistic rationalism that was the official ideology of the Great Crusade, is gone. In its place, the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a god, the specific religious fanaticism that the emperor explicitly prohibited, the Inquisition that burns psychers, the ecclesiarchy that controls religious practice across the Imperium, the Space Marine chapters, distributed and limited by the Codex Astartes, the endless defensive wars against chaos and Xenos, and internal heresy. Horus was shown in the warp on Davin's moon, a future where the Emperor was worshipped as a god and the Primarchs were forgotten. He was told this was the outcome of the Emperor's plan, that the Emperor intended to become a divine figure and use the machinery of religion to control humanity. He was shown this as justification for rebellion. He was shown it as something to prevent. The rebellion produced exactly this outcome. The heresy created the conditions for the Emperor's apotheosis. The worship that Horus was shown and found intolerable became inevitable the moment he struck. This is not the Chaos Gods being subtle. It is them being honest in the most cruel possible way. They showed Horus the truth, and they knew that knowing the truth would make him do the thing that guaranteed it. What did not break? Everything that the heresy cost. The lives, the worlds, the Primarchs, the Emperor's freedom, the integrity of the Great Crusade's dream must be weighed against what remained. Humanity survived, not the humanity that existed before the heresy. The humanity that had been united by the Great Crusade, that had been a species organized around reason and the specific project of a unified and rational civilization. That humanity did not survive. What survived was something more ragged, more fearful, more brutal, organized around survival rather than flourishing. But it survived. The million worlds, the Space Marine chapters that protect them, the guardsmen who hold the line with weapons that are barely adequate against what they face, the ordinary people who live and die on those worlds, mostly never knowing the full scope of the threats being turned aside on their behalf. The heresy was a betrayal. It was a catastrophe. It was the specific outcome of grievances that were real and manipulation that was deliberate, of father and sons who loved each other and could not reach each other across the distance between the divine and the mortal. it was not the end. The war that it started has been running for 10,000 years. It will run for 10,000 more, perhaps. The Eye of Terror still exists. The traitor Primarchs still plot within it. Abaddon the Despoiler, who served as Horus's first captain, who took the name Despoiler rather than inherit the name of the man he followed, has launched 13 Black Crusades into the Imperium. The 14th is underway, or has recently ended, depending on where in the timeline you are standing. The Emperor sits on the Golden Throne. He does not speak. Whether he hears is unknown. Whether he has a plan, or whether the plan died with Horus on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, and what remains is simply the specific stubbornness of a divine will that has not yet found the moment to let go. The Imperium does not know. It prays and does not know. A son who loved his father. There is a version of the Horus Heresy that is not a story about a galaxy-spanning civil war at all. It is a story about a son who loved his father and felt that love go unacknowledged. A father who trusted his son with everything except his reasons. A relationship so freighted with power and expectation, and the specific difficulty of two beings so different from each other trying to be what the other needed, that chaos did not have to create the wound. It only had to find it and press. The Emperor made sons to conquer a galaxy. He did not know, or did not think carefully enough about, what it meant to make sons, what they would need from him beyond purpose, what they would feel when the purpose was given to another and the father left without explanation. Horus was told he was chosen above all his brothers. He was given the galaxy to command. He was not told why his father left, what his father was building, what place was waiting for him in the Imperium that the Webway project would have made possible. He asked, received silence, and into that silence, on a plague moon orbiting a world called Davin, a voice came that was not silence. The Horus Heresy is the story of what silence costs, what it costs to love someone and not be able to tell them why, what it costs to be loved by someone who cannot tell you in words you can receive. What happens when the space between two people, even a father and the son he made, is filled by something that wants them both destroyed? The dream of the Great Crusade died. The Emperor is on the Golden Throne. The galaxy burns slowly on a fire that started in a tent on a plague moon, where a dying son was offered a vision and chose to believe it. This has been the entire Horus Heresy timeline, from the creation of the Primarchs to the death of the dream and the beginning of the 10,000 years of war that followed. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Tonight we go back into the middle of the heresy, to the stories that unfolded alongside Isstvan and the Long March to Terra. Stories of brothers who tried to do the right thing and had every choice taken from them. Stories of what loyalty looks like when the structures that gave it meaning are burning. Magnus the Red, the scholar who knew too much. Of all the tragedies the Horus Heresy produced, the fall of Magnus the Red is among the most precisely cruel. Not because he was weak or corruptible or secretly hungry for power, but because he was, at every step, trying to be good, and the universe arranged itself to make every attempt at goodness into a catastrophe. Magnus was the most powerful psyker among all the Primarchs. Red-skinned, a single-eyed, a physical mutation that marked him as unusual, even among beings that were themselves extraordinary. He landed on Prospero when the Chaos Gods scattered the infant Primarchs, and he found there a world that valued exactly what he was, a civilization of scholars and psychers who had built their culture around the patient accumulation of knowledge and the careful use of psychic gifts that many other human cultures feared and condemned. He thrived. The Thousand Sons became a legion of scholars as much as warriors. Each Space Marine in a specific cult or fellowship organized around a different school of psychic discipline, a library of military and mystical knowledge that had no parallel anywhere in the Great Crusade. The Emperor valued Magnus in the specific way the Emperor valued those sons who had capabilities he needed. He shared with Magnus secrets he shared with no one else, including, crucially, knowledge of the Chaos Gods, of the warp's true nature, of the dangers that the Imperial truth was designed to navigate. Magnus knew more about what the universe actually contained than almost anyone alive. He knew too much in one specific sense. He knew that his own legion's practice of sorcery was causing a mutation problem. The flesh change, a chaotic physical mutation that was consuming his Space Marines one by one, their bodies losing coherence, the warp energy they worked with turning against them. He had bargained with something in the warp to stop it years earlier, though he did not fully understand what he had bargained with or what the price would eventually be. The mutation stopped. Something had agreed to stop it, and he had agreed to something in return. The implications of this bargain would only become clear later. The Council of Nicaea. The Emperor convened the Council of Nicaea to settle a question that had been building throughout the Great Crusade: whether psychic powers were a resource to be used or a danger to be controlled. On one side, Magnus himself, who argued that psychic capability was humanity's birthright and that suppressing it was surrendering the most powerful tool humanity possessed against the threats of the galaxy. On the other, Leman Russ, whose instincts were entirely hostile to sorcery and its practitioners, and the Sisters of Silence and others who catalogued the specific horrors that uncontrolled psychic power had produced. The Emperor ruled psychic powers were to be controlled. Librarians, the Space Marine psychers who had formalized psychic capability within the legions, were to cease practicing. Sorcery was banned. The use of psychic gifts for anything beyond the most basic sanctioned applications was forbidden. Magnus disagreed with this ruling in every fiber of his being. He was also the Emperor's son, and the Emperor had given a direct command. He accepted it. He returned to Prospero and privately continued his research. He rationalized this to himself. The edicts of Nicaea were about sorcery that endangered others, and his careful scholarly pursuit of knowledge was different in character, if not in category, from the reckless use of warp power that the Council had condemned. He was wrong about this, but he believed it, and the belief was not entirely stupid. The line between careful scholarship and dangerous sorcery is not always obvious from inside either. The impossible choice. When Magnus learned what Horus had become, when his psychic perception, which extended further and more clearly than any other Primarchs, showed him the truth of Davin and the corruption that had followed, he faced a problem with no good solution. He needed to warn the Emperor. He had to do it fast. The only means of communication available over interstellar distances were astropathic messages, psychically transmitted, slow, unreliable, potentially intercepted. By the time a conventional warning reached Terra, it might be too late. He could reach Terra himself, directly, using the full power of his psychic gift and the collective strength of the 1,000 Suns' greatest sorcerers. He could project his consciousness across the galaxy and appear before the Emperor in spirit form and deliver the warning in real time. But this would be a direct and obvious violation of the Edict of Nicaea, and it would require a working of warp power on a scale that his own senior advisors, including his first captain, Arzek Ahriman, told him was unwise. There were other ways, better ways that did not require breaking a direct imperial command. Magnus did not listen. The galaxy was at stake. His father needed to know. He performed the ritual. He reached Terra. He delivered his warning. The Emperor felt the psychic projection tear through the defenses of the Imperial Palace and understood immediately what it meant. Not the warning itself, but the act. Magnus had used forbidden sorcery, had broken the Edict of Nicaea. He had violated the Emperor's direct command and the specific catastrophe that none of them had anticipated. The psychic force Magnus used to breach the distance between Prospero and Terra was sufficient to shatter the carefully constructed wards protecting the webway gate beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's webway project, the decades-long effort to build a human route through the Eldar's ancient dimensional network to free humanity from the specific vulnerability of warp travel, depended on those wards. Without them, demons began flooding through the webway into the tunnels beneath the palace. The Emperor could not simply leave the gate unguarded. He spent the remaining years of the heresy managing the breach that Magnus's well-intentioned warning had created, and unable to direct the heresy's military response because he was personally holding back a demonic incursion through his own basement. Magnus had tried to save the Imperium and had, in doing so, created one of the conditions that made the Siege of Terra almost succeed. Prospero burns. Horus knew the Space Wolves had been dispatched to retrieve Magnus. He intercepted the order and altered it, the specific manipulation of communications that a Warmaster in command of the galaxy's largest military force could manage. The Space Wolves were told not to retrieve Magnus, but to destroy him, to prosecute the full punishment available for a Primarch who had defied the Emperor's direct command. Leman Russ, who had never trusted Magnus, who had always found the scholar Primarch's relationship with the warp disturbing, led his legion to Prospero. Magnus saw them coming. His psychic perception extended far enough to know they were approaching, to understand what was coming, to have time to organize a defense or an evacuation. He chose neither. He stood on the surface of Prospero as the Space Wolves' fleet descended, and he refused to fight until the very last moment. The accounts of why vary. Some suggest he felt responsible for what had happened and accepted punishment. Some suggest he had seen enough of the future to know that what was coming was the warp's trap closing, and that fighting it made no difference. Some suggest he simply could not bring himself to order his sons to die fighting their brothers. The city of Tizca, the great domed capital of Prospero, where the Thousand Suns libraries and pyramids and accumulated millennia of scholarship had been organized, was bombarded from orbit. The Space Wolves descended, the Custards descended, the Sisters of Silence descended, whose specific gift was the negation of psychic power, whose presence turned the Thousand Suns' greatest weapon against them. Magnus fought when the fighting could no longer be avoided. He fought Leman Russ himself, 2 Primarchs in the ruins of a civilization that the heresy had destroyed before Horus fired his first open shot. He was losing eventually, not because he was weaker, but because the Sisters of Silence's psychic negation was unraveling the specific form of power he relied on. Tzeentch took him, the chaos god whose domain was change and sorcery, and the specific madness of too much knowledge and too many schemes, who had been watching the Thousand Suns since before Magnus understood what the warp contained, who had arranged the bargain that stopped the flesh change, who had been present in every step of Magnus's relationship with psychic power, reached in and carried the surviving Thousand Suns to the planet of the sorcerers, a demon world in the eye of terror. Magnus had not chosen chaos. Chaos had arranged every step of his path so that refusing it meant the death of everyone he had responsibility for. He went. He hated it. He served. The Battle of Calth. While the burning of Prospero was happening, something else was being prepared in the realm of Ultramar. The Word-Bearers, Lorga's legion, and the most devoted of all the traitor forces, the ones who had spent decades working toward the heresy and who felt the most theological investment in its success, had been given a specific mission. Calth was the most important strategic world in Ultramar, a gathering point for the Ultramarines and their armies. The Word-Bearers and Ultramarines had been ordered to muster there for what was supposed to be a joint campaign. It was not a joint campaign. The Word-Bearers arrived first. They made preparations. When the Ultramarines' fleet arrived, the Word-Bearers opened fire without warning, not just on the defending fleet, but on the Ultramarines' troop transports, on the orbital infrastructure, on everything that Calth's population depended on. The battle in space was followed by battles on the surface and in the underground cities that Calth's population had built as shelter. And then the Word-Bearers' sorcerers performed a ritual that they had been building toward through the entire Shadow Crusade, a working that corrupted the light of Calth's sun, bathing the surface in deadly radiation. Calth's surface became uninhabitable. Its population retreated permanently underground. The agrarian world that had been Ultramar's breadbasket was, in a single day, transformed into something that could sustain life only in sealed environments. Robert Gilliman fought this engagement personally. He tracked Corphiron, Lorga's foster father and first captain, across the surface of Calth and confronted him in single combat. He did not kill him, and Corphiron escaped into the warp, and the Ultramarines won Calth, in the sense that the Word-Bearers were eventually driven off and the remaining population survived. But they won something that looked like rubble and radioactive sky. The Shadow Crusade and the Ruin Storm. The Word-Bearers did not stop at Calth. While Gilliman consolidated his forces and worked to understand the full scope of what had happened, Lorga and Angron continued through Ultramar, burning world after world, not for military advantage, but for the specific ritual purpose of feeding the demonic entity their sorceries were constructing. The Ruin Storm, a warp phenomenon generated by mass ritual sacrifice across dozens of worlds, by the burning of hundreds of millions of people, in the specific way that the chaos gods find most nourishing, and a storm that made enormous sections of the galaxy inaccessible to reliable warp travel, isolating Guilliman and his armies in Ultramar, cutting them off from Terra, making it impossible for the largest surviving Loyalist legion to participate in the heresy's decisive battles. This was the design. Every world the Shadow Crusade burned was not simple destruction. It was fortification of an invisible barrier. Horus needed Guilliman's Ultramarines kept away from Terra for long enough to make the siege work. The Ruin Storm achieved this. 3 entire Primarchs and their legions, Guilliman, the Lion, Sanguinius, were stranded for most of the heresy's remaining years in Ultramar, building a contingency civilization while the decisive conflict happened without them. The specific cruelty of this arrangement. Every mortal who died in the Shadow Crusade died to ensure that the Loyalist legions could not protect the Emperor at the moment when he needed protection most. What loyalty costs? Nathaniel Garrow, who escaped on the Eisenstein and carried the first warning of the heresy to Terra, spent years afterward working as Malcador's agent, a knight-errant tasked with finding loyal Space Marines scattered across the heresy's theatre and recruiting them for purposes that Malcador revealed only gradually. He was building something, the specific institution that would eventually become the Grey Knights and the broader apparatus of the Inquisition. He was a Death Guard Space Marine who had watched his legion become servants of Nurgle. He had abandoned everything, his legion, his Primarch, the structure that gave his life meaning, because loyalty to the Emperor and to what the Emperor stood for was, in the end, more important than loyalty to the organization those things had been entrusted to. This is the specific quality that the heresy tests in everyone it touches. Where does loyalty live when the structures built to contain it have been corrupted? When your legion turns traitor, do you turn with it? When your Primarch has been twisted into something that serves the enemies of everything he was made to protect, does the loyalty to the Primarch outweigh the loyalty to the cause? The loyal Space Marines of the traitor legions, the ones who died on Isstvan III, the ones who escaped and fought on as shattered legions, are the ones who found their way to Malcador's service, answered this question the same way Garrow had. Loyalty to the person was secondary to loyalty to the principle. The principle survived even when the legions that were supposed to embody it did not. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain. The fates of all the suns, and the long shadow the heresy cast across 10,000 years. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Tonight is the story of 18 beings, what they were made to be, what the heresy made of them, and where they ended. Some of these stories are tragedies in the classical sense, beings of extraordinary capability who were destroyed by the specific flaw the chaos gods found in them. Some are mysteries the law keeps open deliberately. Some are something stranger, fates that feel less like endings than transformations into something the galaxy has not yet finished accounting for. 18 sons, 1 father, 1 war. 18 different answers to the question of what a being made for greatness does when greatness has been corrupted. The traitors, Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the sons of Horus, Warmaster, the most gifted of all the sons in the specific quality of command, the ability to make others better simply by being near them, to inspire loyalty that was freely given rather than merely obligated. He was not simply a great warrior or a great general, though he was both. He was the person that even other Primarchs wanted to follow. The Chaos Gods found his specific flaw, pride, and the wound of a beloved son who felt his father's trust without receiving his father's explanation. They showed him the truth and offered a lie dressed as a solution. He accepted. He spent years being the Warmaster while being something else entirely, the specific performance of loyalty to a project he was working to destroy. At the end, in the moment before his soul was annihilated by the Emperor's final strike, the accounts suggest he returned to himself, the Chaos God's power withdrawn, Horus Lupercal present for one final moment, understanding what he had become and asking his father to finish it. The Emperor did. Not just his life, but his soul, destroyed so completely that no echo remained in the warp. Of all the things the heresy cost, this may be among the most significant, the soul of the Emperor's most beloved son, unmade so thoroughly that even death could not preserve it. Lorga Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, the most genuinely devout of all the sons, whose theological conviction was so complete that the Emperor's rejection of it broke him in ways that no military defeat could have. He did not fall to chaos because he was weak or vicious. He fell because he needed to believe in something, and the Emperor explicitly told him that the thing he believed in was wrong. He found the Chaos Gods and discovered that they would accept his worship, and he devoted himself to them with the specific totality of a being whose capacity for faith had nowhere else to go. He ascended to Demon Prince status after the heresy. He meditates now in a deep place in the warp. He has been largely absent from the active conflicts of the 41st millennium. Whether this represents contentment or something else, the lore does not specify. Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children, the most aesthetically gifted of the sons, who valued perfection in all its forms, whose legion reflected this in the specific quality of their martial excellence and their cultural refinements. He encountered the Lair Blade, a demon weapon bound with the essence of Slaanesh, during a Great Crusade campaign, and kept it despite warnings. The weapon possessed him gradually, feeding his perfectionism until it became a hunger for sensation that had no natural limit. Slaanesh is the god of perfection and excess simultaneously, the divine power that holds that the search for the perfect experience justifies everything that the search costs. Fulgrim descended so completely into this that what he became was barely recognizable as the being who had once been the Emperor's most beautiful son. He beheaded Ferrus Manus, his closest friend. He ascended to Demon Prince of Slaanesh. What he pursues now in the Eye of Terror is pleasures that the human mind cannot encompass. Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, who had grown up in a world of toxins, who had made himself immune to every poison by exposure, who had feared and despised psychers his entire life. The specific quality of someone who has watched power used carelessly and decided that power itself is the problem. His first captain, Calth Typhon, had been corrupted years before the heresy began, and had been preparing the Death Guard's path to Nurgle in secret. Mortarion was brought to chaos when a warp storm stranded the Death Guard's fleet in the warp. Weeks of exposure to the Imperium, disease eating through the Legion, despite every immunity Mortarion had developed, every plague breaking the bodies of warriors who had never broken before. Nurgle offered relief. Mortarion accepted. His specific irony, the man who spent his life making himself immune to poison, became the god of plague's most devoted champion. He rules now in his plague planet, the greatest champion of Nurgle, Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, who wanted to die alongside his companions on the slave planet and was denied this by the Emperor, who carried the butcher's nails, psycho-surgical implants that amplified aggression through pain, that were slowly killing him, that the Emperor's best minds could not remove. He was the angriest of all the suns, and the rage was not unreasonable. He had been taken from a death he had chosen, placed in command of a legion he had not asked for, given a father who could not give him back what he had lost. A chaos did not need to find a crack in Angron. He was already fractured from the beginning. He was elevated to Demon Prince of Khorne during the Shadow Crusade. The butcher's nails were consumed in the transformation, replaced by something permanent. He has been banished and returned repeatedly across 10,000 years. He cannot be truly defeated. He can only be sent away temporarily. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, who had the finest engineering mind of any of the Primarchs, whose specific genius was for fortification and siege, for the architecture of violence, for making positions that could not be taken, and then taking positions that could not fall, who spent the Great Crusade being assigned the worst postings, the siege missions that ground through years without glory, the defensive operations that won territory without producing the specific achievements that inspired legend. He felt used rather than valued. His resentment was not unreasonable either. His fall to chaos was a fall into purpose. The Chaos Gods offered him wars worth fighting, enemies worthy of his genius, siege works on a cosmic scale. He rules in Medrengard, a demon world of fortress towers in the Eye of Terror. Conrad Kurz, Primarch of the Night Lords, who had grown up in permanent darkness, who had brought order to his homeworld through the specific governance of total fear, who had been disciplined by the Emperor for methods that produced obedience through terror. He was executed by an assassin eventually, not in battle, but in his quarters, by a woman named Mishen, who had been sent by the High Lords of Terra, and he knew she was coming. He saw it in visions. He let her come. His specific question, the question he posed to any loyalist who came near him during the heresy, was whether the Emperor's galaxy was genuinely better than what the Night Lords produced, whether the light was worth what it cost. He never received an answer he found satisfying. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, whose tragedy we have already heard tonight, who tried to warn the Emperor and broke the Emperor's greatest project in the attempt, who watched Prospero burn and accepted the Chaos God, who offered refuge not because he chose it, but because it was the only thing left standing. He is a demon prince of Tzeentch now, on the planet of the sorcerers. He raids imperial worlds for knowledge, He fights the Space Wolves when the opportunity presents itself. His hatred of Leman Russ for the burning of Prospero has not dimmed across 10,000 years. He is brilliant and bitter and entirely aware of every step that led him here. Alfarius, Primarch of the Alpha Legion, the most opaque of all the sons, the most secretive legion, whose practice of deception extended so completely that even their own members were uncertain at times of who was Alfarius and who was pretending to be Alfarius. He and his twin Omegon joined Horus after receiving a prophecy from an alien cabal that Horus's victory would ultimately destroy the Chaos Gods, that the only way to truly defeat Chaos was to allow Chaos to win in the short term and trigger the specific chain of events that would lead to the Chaos God's destruction. Whether this prophecy was true, whether the Alpha Legion's service to Horus was genuine or a long game played in the Imperium's favor, is one of the heresy's most deliberately maintained mysteries. Alfarius was killed, supposedly, by Rogel Dawn. Omegon may or may not have survived. The Alpha Legion continues to operate in the 41st millennium, working toward goals that no one outside the Legion fully understands. The loyal Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who held Terra, who found the Emperor dying on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, who organized the Great Scouring and then faced the shattering of his legion into chapters, which he resisted, which he eventually accepted, which cost him the specific pride of a being who had built something and was being told it must be broken for the good of what it protected. He is believed killed during the First Black Crusade, centuries after the heresy. Only his hands were recovered. The Imperial Fists venerate these hands. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, who burned Prospero on orders that had been manipulated by Horus, who spent the heresy fighting as Russ always fought, directly, ferociously, without the strategic complexity of a Guilliman or the deceptive genius of an Alfarius, simply with overwhelming force and the specific loyalty of a warrior who had chosen his father and did not change his mind. After the heresy, he walked into the Eye of Terror during a feast, leaving behind a prophecy of the wolf time, a final battle at the end of everything when he would return. 10,000 years have passed. He has not come back. Yet, Jagatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, who fought the Siege of Terra, who led a jet bike charge through the Death Guard siege lines that bought critical time for the palace's defense, who disappeared afterward into the webway pursuing raiders who had taken prisoners from his legion. The webway is vast. He has not returned. Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, who survived Isstvan III with a fraction of his legion, who spent years rebuilding, who undertook genetic experiments to accelerate the creation of new space marines that produced results he was not proud of. He departed into the Eye of Terror after the heresy, having become something more than human through these experiments. He sent back one word: nevermore. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, who was wounded by a poisoned blade in the wars following the heresy and placed in stasis, I suspended in the moment of dying, preserved on Macraga for 10,000 years. He returned in the 41st millennium through the specific miracle of a god's gift through an unlikely intermediary. He is now the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the highest position in the Imperium's civilian governance, held by a man who finds the Imperium of the 41st millennium deeply disturbing and is trying to rebuild it into something the Great Crusade would have recognized. He does not know if this is possible. He is trying anyway. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, whose death has already been told, whose body rests on Baal, whose psychic imprint persists in the gene seed of his sons. Every blood angel carries the specific echo of his final moments, and when they die as he died, seeing what he saw, feeling what he felt. He is gone, but not entirely absent. Ferrus Magnus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, who died on Isstvan III, beheaded by Fulgrim in a duel that ended when he could not bring himself to fight his brother with the full commitment that defeating a demon-touched Fulgrim required. The Iron Hands have spent 10,000 years processing this loss in the specific way of a culture organized around the removal of weakness, by deciding that the weakness was emotion itself, that grief and love and attachment were the biological failures that had killed their Primarch, that excising these through cybernetic replacement was the solution. They have not entirely resolved whether this is correct. Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, who is a perpetual, who cannot truly die, whose soul returns after apparent death to reclaim its body or create a new one, who was captured and tortured by Conrad Kurz for months during the heresy, who eventually escaped, who disappeared. He has appeared periodically across the millennia and vanished again. His legion keeps faith that he will return. Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, who spent the heresy in campaigns that kept him absent from the decisive moments. Whether this was strategic or circumstantial is one of the questions the Dark Angels' history has never cleanly answered. Who returned to Caliban to find Luther, his second in command and oldest companion, had led a rebellion in his absence, who fought Luther in a duel so violent it destroyed the planet, who was found injured and taken to the Dark Angels' Rock, the asteroid that replaced Caliban as their fortress monastery, and placed in a sleep from which he has recently awakened in the 41st millennium. He returned to find an Imperium 10,000 years changed from the one he last knew. He is working to understand it. The Dark Angels' secret, that some of their number fell during the heresy, and that the chapter has spent 10 millennia hunting them, has made them the most secretive of all the chapters. What 18 became, the 18 sons, 9 who turned, 9 who stayed. Some destroyed, some elevated to Demon Prince, some still sleeping, some returned, some still missing, some carrying the marks of what the heresy cost them in ways that have not diminished across 10,000 years. What the Emperor made, he could not entirely control. What he made were people, beings of extraordinary capability, yes, beings that carried his own genetic material, yes, beings intended to be weapons and administrators and exemplars of human potential, but also beings who could be hurt, who could feel abandoned, who could be found by enemies who understood how to use those hurts. The heresy is the story of what happens when love and power and expectation and silence intersect in ways that none of the participants could entirely manage. The Emperor loved his sons. His sons loved him. Even the ones who turned against him were motivated, at the root of the motivation, by the specific grief of feeling that love go unacknowledged. All 18 of them, in 18 different ways. Sleep well. One part remains, the long shadow, and what the heresy means 10,000 years later. Welcome back. This is the final part. Let everything slow. We are nearly at the end of a very long story. What survives a heresy? 10,000 years is a number that is difficult to feel. It is longer than recorded human civilization on the planet the heresy was fought to protect. It is long enough for the memory of events to become myth, for myth to become religion, for religion to become the foundational architecture of how billions of people understand their existence. The Horus Heresy ended. The golden age of the Great Crusade ended with it. That specific historical moment when the Emperor walked among his sons and humanity was being remade into something that might have reached across the entire galaxy with its full potential intact. What replaced it was the 41st millennium, the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war. The Imperium that exists 10,000 years after the Siege of Terra is the direct consequence of a betrayal that lasted 9 years. Every institution, every ideology, every defining feature of the setting that Warhammer 40,000 inhabits is downstream from what happened on Davin's moon and the battlefields of Isstvan and the bridge of the vengeful spirit. The imperial cult. The emperor explicitly forbade religion. The imperial truth, the atheistic rationalism that was the official ideology of the Great Crusade, was designed specifically to prevent the Chaos Gods from having the specific foothold in human civilization that worship provides. If humans do not believe in supernatural beings, the supernatural beings cannot be worshipped. If they cannot be worshipped, they cannot draw on the specific psychic energy that mortal faith generates and that the Chaos Gods consume as sustenance. The imperial truth failed, not because it was wrong about the nature of the universe. It was substantially correct, but because it did not provide what human beings need from belief. It told people what was not true. It did not give them something to hold on to in the dark. The Great Crusade's most zealous promoters of the imperial truth, the iterators who travelled with the expeditions and explained the emperor's philosophy to newly conquered populations, could not compete with the specific emotional power of the faiths they were replacing. After the heresy, with the emperor on the golden throne and unable to correct the record, the imperial cult grew, slowly at first, and then with the specific acceleration that happens when a figure who cannot deny being a god is treated as one. The emperor became divine in the faith of the Imperium. Temples were built, priests were ordained. The specific religious structure that Lorga had been punished for building on conquered worlds during the Great Crusade became the official ideology of the Imperium within centuries of the heresy's end. Horus had been shown a future where the emperor was worshipped as a god. He had been told this was what the emperor planned. He had rebelled to prevent it. The rebellion created exactly that future. This is the precise irony at the heart of the setting. The heresy produced the thing it was supposedly fought to prevent. The Chaos Gods showed Horus a true vision and offered a false solution. The solution was fought for. The vision came true anyway. The Black Crusades. With Horus dead and the traitor legions fled to the Eye of Terror, the specific question became, What now? The war was over. The traitors were driven from Imperial space. The Great Scouring had hunted them to the boundary of the warp anomaly that was their refuge. Could the Imperium pursue them into the Eye? It could not. The Eye of Terror is a place where the laws of reality are the Chaos God's preferences. An Imperial fleet entering the Eye is an Imperial fleet fighting in an environment that wants to kill them regardless of the mortal enemies they've also brought along. The traitor legions went into the Eye, and the Imperium stopped at the edge. Ezekiel Abaddon had been Horus's first captain, the most capable warrior in the Sons of Horus after Horus himself, and the one who had argued against Horus's corruption and lost, who had watched the Warmaster become what he became and served anyway. After the heresy, with Horus destroyed, Abaddon refused to take his name. He refused to lead the Sons of Horus under a name that belonged to a man who had been the Chaos God's pawn. He renamed them the Black Legion, the color of mourning for everything the heresy had cost, and named himself Abaddon the Despoiler. He launched the first Black Crusade within centuries of the heresy's end, then the second, then the third. 13 Black Crusades across 10,000 years, each one a surge of chaos forces from the Eye of Terror into Imperial space, each one testing a different point in the Imperium's defenses, each one teaching Abaddon something about what it would take to break through. The 13 was the one that succeeded in ways the previous 12 had not. Cadia, the fortress world that guarded the Eye of Terror's primary exit point, the world that had held back chaos forces for 10,000 years, fell. The Cicatrix Maledictum, a great warp rift, tore across the galaxy and divided the Imperium in two. The grim darkness got darker. The Returned, the 41st millennium's most significant development, the event that has defined the current state of Warhammer 40,000, is the return of Primarchs. Robert Guilliman came back first. Through the specific miracle of an elven death god's gift, channeled through the daughters of Cain, the poison that had been killing him for 10,000 years was purged. He woke on Macragge and found an Imperium that would have horrified the man who wrote the Codex Astartes. He read 10,000 years of Imperial history. He found an organization that had spent its entire existence fighting to survive, that had become, through the accumulated pressure of that survival, the specific combination of brutal theocracy and grinding bureaucracy that the Great Crusade was supposed to make unnecessary. He found the imperial cult and understood that the Emperor's explicit prohibition of religion had become, in the Emperor's name, the religion of the entire Imperium. He found it disturbing. He has expressed this in terms that make the imperial hierarchy uncomfortable. He has also accepted it, not because it is correct, but because dismantling the structure that 10 billion people's faith is built on, in the middle of a war for survival, is not the work of a moment. He serves now as Lord Commander, the highest political position in the Imperium, held for the first time in 10,000 years by a being who was there at the beginning. He is trying to rebuild. He is finding that rebuilding is harder than building, because you cannot simply clear the field. The field contains people who need the structures that exist, even when those structures are failures. Lion L. Jonsson returned more recently from the deep sleep beneath the rock. He found an Imperium his own legion had been keeping secrets from for 10,000 years. The secret of the fallen, the dark angels who had turned during the heresy, that the chapter had hunted in silence rather than acknowledge. He is working through what this means. On the traitor side, Angron has returned from banishment multiple times. Mortarion fights in the galaxy's living realms rather than simply the Eye. Magnus leads his 1,000 sons against the Imperium's worlds. Fulgrim pursues his pleasures. The demon Primarchs of the traitor legions are more actively present in the 41st millennium than at any point since the Scouring. The war is not cooling, it is heating. What the Emperor is, on the Golden Throne, in the depths of the Imperial Palace on Terra, the Emperor of mankind sits. His body is a corpse that has not fully died. His soul is too large, too powerful, and too fundamentally resistant to extinction to let go. 10,000 years of sustained divine will holding on to existence through the specific machinery of the Golden Throne, and the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day, whose life force feeds the beacon of the Astronomicon and holds shut the breach in the webway that Magnus's warning opened. Whether he is conscious is one of the most hotly debated questions in the setting. Whether he experiences anything, whether 10,000 years on the Golden Throne is 10,000 years of suffering, or awareness without sensation, or something that human categories of experience are inadequate to describe. The law does not answer. He cannot answer. Whether he has a plan is another question. As some law suggests his psychic power is growing stronger, even as his body remains inert. That the specific form of existence the Golden Throne sustains is allowing a divine being to evolve beyond the need for a body. That what is coming, eventually, is not the Emperor's death, but the Emperor's rebirth into something that doesn't require the machinery of a mortal body anymore. Whether this is true or hope dressed as theology, the Imperium cannot know. It prays in the specific way that a species facing the darkness prays, not necessarily because it believes the prayer will be heard, but because praying is something to do in the dark. The long dark. The grim darkness of the far future is not the end point of a story. It is the middle of one. Warhammer 40,000 does not present a civilization in its final decline. It presents a civilization at its most tested, fighting on every front simultaneously against threats that are genuinely existential, and surviving not because it has adequate resources or enlightened leadership, but because the sheer weight of numbers and the specific stubbornness of billions of ordinary humans who keep fighting keeps the darkness at bay. The heresy started this, not by creating the darkness. The darkness predates the heresy, predates the Great Crusade, predates the Emperor's emergence from whatever anonymity he maintained during the Age of Strife. The galaxy has always been dangerous. The Chaos Guards have always existed. The alien threats have always been there. And the heresy started this specific darkness. The darkness that comes from inside the house. The darkness that has a human face. The darkness that was made from the specific qualities that make humans capable of greatness. Love, pride, faith, devotion. The hunger for understanding. The refusal to accept limits. Horus was made from the Emperor's genetic material. The heresy was made from the Emperor's sons. The darkness that has been spreading for 10,000 years came from the same source as the light that is trying to push it back. This is what the setting will not let you look away from. A story that isn't over. The Horus Heresy ended. The conflict it started did not. Guilliman is trying to rebuild an Imperium that has been shaped by 10,000 years of desperate survival into something brittle and rigid and incapable of the flexibility that rebuilding requires. He is trying anyway. The lion has returned and is working beside him. Somewhere in the Eye of Terror, Leman Russ waits for the wolf time that the prophecy promises. Vulcan appears and disappears. Corvus Corax became something strange in the darkness. The Emperor is on the Golden Throne. The Chaos Gods have 5 members now. The Great Horned Rat, having joined the pantheon of ruinous powers through the same Skaven Vermindoom that tore through the Age of Sigmar in a different corner of the same fictional universe's spirit. The Cicatrix Maledictum divides the galaxy. Cadia has fallen, but the Imperium endures. In the specific way that things endure when the alternative is not enduring. Through the accumulated stubbornness of billions of people who have decided that the galaxy is still worth fighting for, even when it gives them very little reason to believe this. This has been the entire Horus Heresy timeline, from the creation of the Primarchs in the genetic laboratory beneath the Emperor's palace, to the scattering of infants across the galaxy, to the Great Crusade's golden years, to Davin's moon and the corruption of the Warmaster, to Isstvan and the Dropsite Massacre, to the burning of Prospero and the corrupted son of Calth, to the Siege of Terra and the death of Sanguinius and the duel on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, to the Golden Throne and the 10,000 years of darkness that followed, told slowly, over 8 nights, for the long dark between sleep and waking. The Emperor endures, the Imperium endures, and in the Eye of Terror, in the demon worlds and fortress monasteries of the Chaos Gods, the sons of the Emperor who chose wrong are still there, waiting. Good night.